My name is Cora. I'm 35 years old and currently an architect living in Seattle. Just last week, I stood beside my father's hospital bed, the man I believed would never keep secrets from me, when he grabbed my hand and whispered, trembling, "Don't trust the lawyer. Check the attic. They've taken what's rightfully yours." An hour later, he passed away. I thought I was his only child, the one who stood by him through every chapter of his final years. But during the will reading, surrounded by relatives, friends, and even strangers, I sat in stunned silence as the name Brian, someone I had never heard of before, was announced as the sole heir to everything. Have you ever had someone in your own family hide a secret so big it flipped your entire world upside down? If you've ever felt the sting of betrayal, leave a comment below. Hit like if you believe that truth always finds a way. And don't forget to subscribe, because what my father left in that attic led me to a truth no one ever saw coming. Let me tell you everything. I still remember the winter I turned 6. My mother died from a sudden heart attack. My father, a quiet man back then, packed up all memories of her and moved me from Portland to a 3-story wooden house on the outskirts of Seattle. He never remarried throughout my childhood. At least that's what I had always believed with absolute certainty. The mornings he made coffee while I peeled apples at our old tiled kitchen counter. The summer nights we pitched tents in the backyard. The holidays where he'd lift me onto a wooden stool to say a toast in front of the family. Every part of my memory was filled with my father's presence, and absolutely no sign that he'd ever had another child. And yet that day, in a room filled with the smell of old wood and worn leather, I sat frozen as Blake Carson, my father's longtime friend and attorney, clearly stated that the entire Douglas Company construction company, the house, the shares, and all related assets would be handed over to Brian Douglas, eldest son. Silence fell over the room. I turned to Blake. His face was calm, eerily so. "I'm sorry," I managed to say, trying to stay composed. "Who is Brian?" My question dropped like a stone into what had seemed like a still lake. A man around 32, wearing an expensive gray suit and perfectly slicked back hair, stood up from the back row and stepped forward. He smiled, not the warm kind but the kind worn by someone who already knew he'd won. "Hi there," he said with a slight Southern California accent. "I'm Brian, your older half-brother." I stood, heart pounding in my chest. "I've never heard Dad mention you. Ever." He shrugged. Not surprised. He wasn't always great at handling the past. I turned to Blake. "Is this real?" Blake nodded, placing a thick stack of papers on the table. "There's a birth certificate, DNA test confirmation, and a notarized will dated exactly 1 month before Mr. Douglas passed." "I'm sorry, Cora." There were no words of comfort. Not a single mention of me in the will. Not the childhood home, not a share of the company, nothing to indicate I had ever been his daughter. Brian returned to his seat like he was inspecting the fruits of his victory. "Oh," he added with a grin, "I'll probably sell the company soon. Land prices at the harbor are going up. That brand. Who needs an old-school construction firm anymore? I'm looking into blockchain. Crypto is the future, little sister." I clenched my jaw. That company was my father's life's work. I've worked there the past 12 years. I've stayed up all night redesigning its entire brand identity. And you're selling it for some hype investment. Brian crossed his arms, raising a brow. "Your work. You were an employee, not an owner. And Dad chose his heir. You need to accept it." I turned to Blake. "I want to challenge the validity of the will. I have the right to request that." Blake didn't flinch, but his voice turned cold. "Cora, I know this is a shock. But the documents have already been filed with the King County Records Office. Unless you have evidence of fraud, this will is legally binding. And I'd advise you not to make things harder for yourself." I balled my fist. Something wasn't right. I felt it like a chill down my spine. My father, the man who raised me on values of honesty and justice, couldn't have erased me like that. Not without a trace. Then I remembered his last words. "Don't trust the lawyer. Check the attic. They've taken what's yours." At the time I thought he was delirious. But now that sentence echoed in my mind like a coded message demanding to be solved. I left the office quietly. Brian didn't bother seeing me out. Blake gave me a hollow nod, like dismissing someone with no power left. Outside, the rain had started to fall, but it wasn't as cold as the rage simmering in my chest. On the way home I stopped by the cemetery. My father's grave was freshly covered, the nameplate still temporary. I stood there a long time as the wind pulled at my hair and coat. "I don't know what you were hiding, Dad," I whispered. "But I'll find out." That night, I sat in the darkened living room of the house that used to be ours. The house where I grew up, where music and laughter once lived. I looked up at the ceiling. The attic. I hadn't been up there since Dad installed an electronic lock 4 years ago, claiming it held company files and architectural plans. I never questioned it. But this was different now. I grabbed a ladder, switched on my flashlight, and pulled down the hatch. The air was thick with dust and the scent of aged wood. Step by step, the floor creaked beneath me. My flashlight scanned across boxes, books, old blueprints. And finally, a wooden panel hidden behind a faded gray blanket. I pulled the cloth aside. Behind it was a small door. The number lock was still intact. I shivered. Dad once told me the code was the day Mom died. I turned the dial. 5120. A soft click echoed. The door swung open to reveal an old metal safe. And when I opened it, I never imagined what I'd find would change the course of my life forever. I knelt on the cold wooden floor of that dust-covered attic, breath shaking as I stared at the partially opened safe. My hand, still dusted with flakes of old paint and wood residue, gently pushed the door further open. The dim flashlight beam landed on a bundle of papers tied with a faded blue ribbon, a yellow envelope, and a small black USB drive. I reached for the papers first, gently undoing the knot. Each page revealed a familiar, sharp handwriting. Dad's handwriting. A will. Written by hand. The opening line made my throat tighten. I, Douglas W. Evans, being of sound mind and full legal capacity, declare this will to affirm. All personal assets and shares in Douglas Company shall be transferred to my only daughter, Cora Lynn Evans, who has supported and contributed to the company's growth for over a decade. I bit my lip, a surge of electricity racing down my spine. This was undeniable proof. A legal will, handwritten, signed, dated, even accompanied by a copy of his ID and official documentation of assets. And the most heartbreaking part was the date on the document. 12 days before my father passed. He wrote this. He had a plan. And somehow someone stopped it from being honored. I turned to the envelope. If you're reading this, it means you found the truth before it was too late. Blake is no longer a friend. Be careful with him. Trust yourself and protect everything I've left, not for wealth but for justice. The handwriting was shakier than usual. He must have written that letter while already in poor health. His words felt like a key, not just unlocking a safe but opening a whole new door inside me. A door of resistance. I picked up the USB drive as if it might break under too much pressure. I couldn't wait until morning. I had to know now. Quietly, I left the attic, walked down the stairs, past the silent kitchen, and headed straight into my father's old study. The desktop computer still sat in the corner of the oak desk, and the swivel chair he used to sit in was faded along the backrest. I plugged in the USB, took a deep breath, and my hands trembled as the cursor hovered over the only file. Recorded 11/4 on final. I double-clicked. There was a soft static hum, then my father's voice, clear, stronger than I remembered it being in his final days. Blake, I want to update the will. I want to leave the entire company to Cora. She deserves it more than anyone else. Pause. Then Blake Carson's voice, the lawyer I used to trust, the man who once carried me on his back when I refused to leave my mom's funeral. Doug, I understand. But are you sure? She's not married, she doesn't have anyone supporting her. Brian has experience in finance. My father nearly growled his words. What experience? He dropped out, lived in Arizona for 7 years before crawling back. Cora's the only one who never left me. Another pause. I heard papers shuffling, the scrape of a chair. All right, Blake said, voice subdued. If that's what you want, I'll prepare the amendment. But you'll need to sign it in front of witnesses. I need more time. No, my father responded firmly. I'll write it by hand. Tomorrow. And you, if anything happens, I'm leaving the handwritten copy in the attic safe. Cora knows the code. The recording ended with the sound of footsteps and a door closing. I pulled the USB out, holding it in my clammy palm. He had planned for everything. Every step. Every detail. And still, it hadn't stopped someone like Blake from doing the unthinkable. I sat there for a long time, no tears, no fury. just a growing emptiness that spread through my body. I was holding a truth too big, too sharp. My phone buzzed. A message from Natalie. Find anything yet? I can't sleep. Got this awful feeling. I replied, I have everything. The original will and the recording. Blake betrayed my dad. Less than 30 seconds later, the phone rang. I answered. Cora. Natalie's voice was urgent. You need to back up everything right now. I have a feeling they're not going to sit still. Are you going to go public? I don't know, I whispered. I need a night to think. But I can't forgive this. You could do something bigger than just going public, she said cautiously. You could flip the whole board. If you play it right. I paused for a few seconds, staring back at the safe, the letter my father had left behind. I won't let him die with that injustice. Let's meet at the usual cafe tomorrow? Bring everything. I'll get my brother. He's a quiet but sharp independent attorney. You need someone behind you who can't be traced. I agreed. After we hung up, I reopened the letter again as if it held another clue. Cora, you have to learn how to read people. Not everyone who stood beside you will stand with you forever. But I believe you'll know who to trust, who's worth walking with to the end. And above all, let the truth speak, not your anger. I folded the letter and placed it into the desk drawer. Then I stood up, walked to the window and looked out over the city lights still glowing in the distance. There were things that had been ripped from my hands. But now I was holding on to something they couldn't take back. The truth. And truth is the most dangerous weapon when you know how to wield it. The next morning, I arrived at the small cafe on the corner of Fremont Avenue, the spot Natalie and I used to meet during our college years. Seattle was drenched in a thin fog, and condensation trickled down the cafe window like hundreds of memories falling all at once. Natalie was already there at a table by the window, her olive trench coat speckled with rain, laptop open, eyes lit with worry and determination when she saw me come in. Did you bring it? She asked softly, her hand curling around her coffee cup like she was steadying herself. I nodded, pulled the envelope from my bag with the handwritten will, the USB, and my father's letter. She handled each item with the care of someone touching evidence in a criminal trial. This is bigger than I thought, Natalie whispered. Last night I sent a photo of the will to my brother. He works at Johnson Miles law firm. He said if you can prove the current will is a fake, Blake could face criminal charges. I was silent. It took a few seconds for what she said to fully settle into my mind. I don't care about suing for the money, I said quietly. I want justice for my dad. He was betrayed by someone who used to be his best friend. Natalie nodded. Then we start here. I've already registered for access to Douglas Coe's financial portal. Even though the company's still private, tax documents and asset transfers are traceable. And you won't believe what I found. She turned her laptop toward me. In the 3 weeks after your dad passed, she said, her voice low, a series of transfers were made from the company's account to a Cayman Islands trust under the name Brian Evans. I gripped my coffee cup, my hand trembling slightly. $742,000, Natalie continued, eyes on the screen. And that's just within less than a month. If this goes on longer, the number will grow. How did he manage that? I thought both signatures were required to withdraw company funds. Blake was listed as co-signer after your dad's stroke. Natalie looked at me. He appointed himself interim controller under emergency power of attorney, but the documents are vague. He may have used that window to manipulate everything. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes for a few seconds, trying to collect the scattered thoughts in my head. Everything was fitting together now like a puzzle I didn't want to complete. Do you know anyone else who might have seen what Blake did? I asked, opening my eyes and locking onto hers. Someone who worked closely with him? Natalie was quiet for a moment, then her eyes lit up. Emma. Emma Sloan. She was Blake's personal assistant for almost 6 years before she got suddenly let go 3 months ago. They claimed it was restructuring, but a friend of mine at the King County Courthouse said Emma once hinted that Blake had too much to hide. I exhaled slowly. Can you find her? Natalie smiled. Already did. That afternoon, we arranged to meet Emma at a small diner in South Capitol Hill. She arrived a few minutes late, wearing a long ash-gray coat, her blonde hair pulled back and a guarded look on her face. She sat at the booth without removing her sunglasses. Cora Evans? She asked, her voice steady but not cold. Yes, I replied, trying to keep my tone friendly. Thank you for coming. Emma glanced at Natalie and nodded slightly. I recognize you, Seattle Herald. Never thought I'd find myself talking to both of you. We just want to know the truth, I said. No pressure. But if Blake did something wrong, I need to know. Emma was silent, her eyes resting on the cup of tea she had ordered. I was about to speak when she broke the silence first. I saw him burn documents, she said slowly. 3 days after your father's funeral, Blake came into the main office around 9 p.m. I was still there finishing up paperwork for another case. I saw him carrying a thick paper bag go into the office and lock the door. She paused. I didn't dare blink. A little while later, a burning smell started spreading. I knocked, but he didn't answer. When I used a spare key to open the door, I saw him burning stacks of papers in the office fireplace. On the desk were the original company contracts, some handwritten documents, and I swear I saw one with Evans written in the header. I clenched my fists under the table. Why didn't you report this? Natalie asked, her voice tense. Because the next morning I was fired, Emma said with a bitter laugh. No warning. No explanation. I was forced to sign a non-disclosure agreement to receive severance. I gasped. Did you keep any copies? No, she shook her head. I'm not that foolish. But, she pulled a small USB drive from her coat pocket. I secretly recorded a call Blake made to Brian right after that day. It's only a few minutes, but it could help. I reached out and took the USB. At that moment, for the first time since my father's death, my heart ached. Not from pain but from hope. Were you afraid? I asked Emma quietly. I was, she replied. But not anymore. Because I see the only person brave enough to do what's right, sitting right here in front of me. We parted in silence. Emma left first, her steps slow but determined. Natalie and I lingered by the street for a moment. The rain was still falling lightly. Tiny drops slid down my hair, cold but comforting. Natalie looked over at me. What will you do with the recording? I looked at her, streetlights reflecting in my tear-filled eyes. I'm going to do what my dad wanted. Bring the truth to light. And if they fight back? Natalie asked. I have nothing left to lose, I whispered. Only what I need to reclaim. When I stepped through the glass door of Robert Thorne's law office, the atmosphere inside was a world away from the chaos outside. Calm, orderly, no room for emotional upheaval. Part of me still couldn't believe I'd come this far. But when I saw Robert rise from his desk, shake my hand with steady eyes and a warm voice, I knew I was exactly where I needed to be. Cora, I've reviewed all the materials you and Natalie provided. The handwritten will, the recording between your father and Blake, Emma Sloane's testimony. All carry legal weight. The issue now is that we must act quickly before Brian and Blake move to hide more assets. I nodded, pulling the USB from my bag that Emma had given me the day before. I need to make sure they can't keep destroying everything my dad built. Robert took the device, plugged it into his computer, eyes focused on the recording. When it ended, he leaned back in his chair, his chest rising slowly as if weighing something very serious. Cora, he said, I will file a civil lawsuit against Blake Carson for document forgery and estate fraud. At the same time, we'll request the court issue an emergency order to freeze Douglas Coe's assets during the investigation. If you agree, I'll file the papers today. I clenched my hands, feeling a surge of energy rise in my chest. Do it. I won't let them trample over my father's name one more day. After signing the legal power of attorney, I left Robert's office under the soft patter of rain outside. Natalie waited in the car, scrolling through her phone, her eyes tense. I called someone, I said as I slid into the passenger seat. She's the only person who stood by my dad through nearly his entire career. Natalie glanced over. Who? Diana Keaton, I replied. Head of planning, worked at Douglas Coe for over 40 years. If anyone knew what my dad planned before his stroke, it's her. We arrived at Diana's house late that afternoon, a classic craftsman-style home in East Seattle. She had retired 3 months earlier, something I'd thought was her own choice. But now I wasn't so sure. Diana opened the door, the late afternoon light casting shadows through the aged white-painted wood frame. She wore a gray cardigan, her silver hair pulled back. When she saw me, she smiled. a sad but sincere smile. Cora, the little girl I knew has grown into a strong woman, she said, opening the door wider to invite us in. I've been hoping you'd come. Her living room was simple, not flashy like other colleagues' homes I'd visited. On the wooden shelves were old photos. My father when he was young, me on my first day at the company, and a picture of the new headquarters opening in 2008. I need to ask you some things, I began, my voice catching as my gaze stopped at a photo of me and my father on my college graduation day. Diana nodded, poured tea and sat across from me. They did something awful, didn't they? Brian's been selling off company properties, I said. Some contracts were cancelled. Some longtime clients turned their backs. And Blake, he forged the will. Diana closed her eyes briefly. I knew something was wrong. Did your dad ever say anything about leaving the company to me? I need to know if, before he had the stroke, he planned something. Diana sighed, then opened a small desk drawer, pulling out an old notebook. 4 days before he fell ill, he called me into his office. He handed me a draft of the transfer contract with your name on it. He asked me to review the terms and scheduled a meeting with the lawyer to finalize it. I froze. So it's true, he intended to hand the company over to me? She nodded. Cora, you're not just his daughter. You've lived every breath of Douglas Coe's projects. You walked with him through the toughest jobs. You saw the future where he only saw bricks and stones. He knew that. I looked at my hands. The years I spent staying late at the office, redrawing every plan, meeting every contractor, giving up vacations with friends. It wasn't all for nothing. Then why does Blake have a different will? Natalie asked, voice full of frustration. Because the day your dad had his stroke, Diana said, eyes distant, the appointment with the lawyer was cancelled. And Blake was the only one with access to the files while he was hospitalized. I felt like someone was draining me dry. So, just a few days too late. Exactly, she said. But don't think you're too late. If the original will is still kept, if there's evidence, justice can still be found. I took Diana's hand, tears filling my eyes. Thank you. Thank you for not staying silent. She smiled, gently squeezing my hand. Your father was a good man. And you, Cora, are the best part he left behind. By the time we left her house, it was fully dark. Natalie drove me home. The two of us remained silent throughout the ride. I stared out the car window as raindrops traced lines down the glass like unnamed emotions waiting to be spoken. At that moment, I wasn't thinking about winning or losing anymore. I only thought of my father's eyes in that old photo, the eyes full of trust, gentle but resolute. And I knew this battle had begun. And I would not back down. Not for money, but for truth, for justice, for him. I never expected to be shaken by a call from Natalie. But when my phone rang at 2 a.m. and her name flashed on the screen, my heart tightened with a strange instinct. Cora, someone just broke into my apartment. I only stepped out for about 10 minutes to run to the convenience store. When I came back, the door was forced open and everything in my place was ransacked. I jumped out of bed and grabbed my coat. Are you okay? Are they still there? No. I'm at my neighbor's across the hall. I saw them through the hallway mirror. 2 people wearing baseball caps and gloves. And Cora, they smashed my laptop. The one with all your lawsuit documents. They didn't take anything, just destroyed that. I sank into a chair. This wasn't a robbery. It wasn't random. They knew who Natalie was. And they wanted to send a warning. I'm coming over now, I said, locking my phone and rushing out like someone was chasing me. Less than 15 minutes later, I was at Natalie's apartment. Police were there talking to the building manager. Natalie was curled up in a blanket by the lobby desk. Her eyes were red and swollen, but her gaze was still fierce. Cora, she said when she saw me and stood up. I'm okay. Really. I'm not hurt. But they know we're going too far. I placed my hand on her shoulder. They're scared. She nodded and pulled a crumpled white envelope from her coat pocket. This was in my mailbox. No postal marks. Clearly someone slipped it in by hand. I opened it. A single computer-printed note, black letters clear. Stop now if you don't want to know who really caused your father's accident. I read it over and over. My throat went dry. This was no longer about inheritance. No longer about forged documents. Someone was trying to threaten me. But at the same time, those words contained something else. A hint. I never thought his death might not have been an accident, I whispered. He just had a stroke. The doctors said so. Natalie looked at me, voice steady but trembling. But before that, he drove to the worksite. Maybe something happened before he got to the hospital. I remembered the garage, where my father always parked his car. He was meticulous about everything, even installing his own cameras there instead of relying on building security. He used to say, "It's not that I don't trust people. I just want to know where to start if something happens." I'd never checked the footage from that system since he passed. Maybe now was the time. The next morning, I returned to the old house, the place where it all began. The attic door still bore dust marks from the last time I opened the safe. But this time I didn't go up. I went down to the underground garage. I hooked up the camera's hard drive to my laptop. The video files were sorted by date. I scrolled back to the moment my father was taken to the hospital, 11 days before he died. There was a clip that made me stop. April 3rd, 4:30 a.m. A man in a dark hoodie and baseball cap entered the garage through the back door, without triggering any alarm. He bent down near my father's old Lexus SUV, the one he still drove himself despite having a driver. I slowed the playback. He pulled out a tool bag. And then something froze my blood. He lay down on the floor, crawling fully under the car. About 5 minutes later, he stood up, packed his tools, and vanished as if he'd never been there. I squinted and rewound again. The image was grainy but clear enough to see him using pliers and something else near the rear wheel system. The brakes. I jumped up, heart pounding. I played more footage from the next day. My father drove out of the garage at 8 a.m. as usual. Unaware that only a few miles ahead his car would lose control, forcing a sharp swerve, and in the panic he'd suffer a stroke right after pulling over. The medical report only stated the cause as a stroke. But if he hadn't panicked because of the accident, would the stroke have happened? I called Robert immediately. "We have video," I said, trying to stay calm. "Someone cut my father's brakes. I want to submit this with the lawsuit. And I want a criminal investigation." Robert's voice darkened. "Cora, if this is true, we're moving from an inheritance dispute to a murder plot. And that means involving the police. I understand. But I can't trust anyone but you. Send me the video. I'll assign forensic experts to verify its authenticity and extract facial images if possible." After I hung up, I watched the footage again. The man was skilled, quick, clean. But he didn't know. My father's cameras captured low-angle shots near the ground. And at one moment, just 1 second, when the man stood up, his cap shifted, revealing a chillingly familiar face. Brian. I had no more doubts. This wasn't just about taking an inheritance. This was a deliberate, calculated conspiracy. And my father nearly died not from illness, but because someone forced him into a panic behind the wheel of a car with cut brakes. I stared at his face in the frozen frame. His eyes were icy cold. No fear. No rush. I clenched my fist. They thought I'd quit if they threatened me. But I'm not like anyone they've faced before. I am Douglas Evans's daughter. And I will expose every piece of the lie, no matter where it leads. Robert called our strategy the signature trap, but I knew exactly what it was. A trap built from truth, patience, and the pain I've carried since my father closed his eyes. On Wednesday afternoon, I arrived at Robert's office an hour early to review every detail. The conference room where we sat had soft lighting, dark wood paneling, and on the table lay the legal drafts meticulously prepared. "We'll put Blake in a position he can't refuse," Robert said, flipping to the first pages of a legal memo disguised as a property redistribution agreement. "He'll think it's a settlement offer, but if he signs, he indirectly admits to having tampered with and altered the original will. It may not be a confession, but it's extremely strong evidence in civil court." I nodded. "And if he refuses to sign?" "We still have the recording, the footage, and Emma's testimony. But if he signs, we can prove Blake knew the original existed and intentionally distorted the inheritance process." I looked down at the papers on the table. The phrase renegotiation of inheritance interests and redistribution of asset values to minimize civil disputes sounded harmless. But beneath that legal language was a hook ready to drag Blake into the dark hole he created. I left Robert's office with the contract in my bag, my heart beating faster than usual. When I got home, Natalie was already waiting in the car. All done, she said, holding up a small silver external hard drive. I just got it back from the forensic technician. They not only recovered a copy from the USB, but also created 2 backups. One stored on the cloud and another encrypted copy sent to the attorney. I breathed a sigh of relief, feeling some weight lift off my chest. Good. Because I think they know we're closing in. Natalie sat quietly for a moment, staring straight ahead. Has Brian reached out? I paused for a second, then nodded. Last night. He turned to me. And I slowly recounted the brief but bitter encounter. I was sitting at a cafe near my house when Brian appeared as if by chance. His light gray suit was expensive, but his face bore the wrinkles of long nights spent sleepless. Cora, he began with an unusually gentle voice, can we talk like adults? I nodded, keeping calm. Look, he lowered his voice, placing his hands on the table, this situation isn't good for anyone. The court, the media, the little articles from Seattle Herald, they're all stirring things up. I just looked at him, saying nothing. Your father is gone, Brian continued. I know you're angry, but we both know this is going too far. I don't want you to ruin the family name. You shouldn't drag yourself into a fight where no one wins. I stayed silent. Finally, he sighed and pulled a thick envelope from his coat pocket. He set it on the table. 30% of the total estate value. No court. You drop the lawsuit. Everything stops. I looked at the envelope like it was a coiled snake in someone else's hand. You think I'm doing all this for money? I asked, my voice calm enough that even I found it strange. He tilted his head slightly. Not for money. But you could choose an easier way. Less pain. For you, and your father's reputation. I smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. My father didn't leave a reputation to bargain with. He left me a reason to fight. And you're wrong if you think I'll bow down. I stood up, not touching the envelope. This isn't a bargain. This is the truth. And no one can bargain with the truth. I left the cafe without looking back. Back in the present, Natalie squeezed my hand tightly. I'm proud of you. Not done yet, I replied. Blake will be at Robert's office tomorrow. Natalie squeezed my hand a little more. I'll be close by. No matter what happens. The next morning at exactly 10 a.m., Blake Carson entered Thorne's law office with a fake confidence and a cold, probing look. His tailored suit and shiny leather shoes were impeccable, but something in the way he moved, hurried, uneasy, said more than any expression on his face. Robert and I waited in the conference room, the documents laid out on the table, the recorder hidden but running. We want to finish this quickly, Robert began, calm and steady. My client seeks no revenge, only to restore the fairness that was the late gentleman's original intention. Blake flipped through the files quickly, expression unreadable. But I saw his eyes linger a bit too long at the bottom of a page, where a faint paragraph was printed. The signatory acknowledges having previously altered, supplemented, or replaced any prior will of Douglas Evans, and was requested by the principal party to make such adjustments. He looked up. What is this? It's the only way for you to withdraw from the lawsuit without facing criminal charges, Robert replied. Sign here and we will not pursue further investigation into interference with inheritance rights. Everything settled out of court. Blake considered for 15 seconds, long enough to know he was backed into a corner. Then without a word he took the pen and signed. I watched him in silence. There was something in that face no longer seasoned as before. Perhaps even he hadn't realized the blade he once wielded was now turning back on him. After Blake left, Robert put the original signed contract into the secure safe. He's confirmed enough for us to move to phase 2. I sat quietly for a moment in the empty room, fingers brushing the wood table. Things were turning around. But deep inside I knew, another storm was waiting outside. And Brian wouldn't sit still much longer. That morning's courtroom was filled with a strangely cold light. Dark brown curtains hung half open beside tall windows, letting the early sunlight cut sharp lines across the tense air. I sat in the front row, hands on my lap, trying to stay calm despite my pounding heart like a hammer hitting my chest. Across from me, Blake Carson sat beside his lawyer, a gray-haired man with a wary gaze. Brian was also there, arms crossed, leaning back in his chair with a mix of disdain and impatience. His expensive suit couldn't hide the exhaustion on his face. Judge Margaret Evers, a woman in her 60s with neatly styled silver hair and a stern gaze, presided over the trial. The civil case between plaintiff Cora Evans and defendant Blake Carson, concerning the validity of Douglas William Evans's will now begin. Her voice was steady and decisive. Robert stood, holding a carefully organized stack of documents. He stepped forward, looking straight at the judge, then turning to the jury. Your Honor, we will prove that the current will, the document Blake Carson submitted after Mr. Douglas Evans's death, is not the deceased's final legal intent. We have a handwritten will with Mr. Douglas's wet signature, clearly naming his daughter as the rightful heir. We have a recording proving Mr. Carson was warned about the handwritten will but deliberately ignored it. And we have a witness who confirms Mr. Carson destroyed the original documents. Blake shifted slightly, his face betraying his discomfort. His lawyer stood to object. Your Honor, the defense contends that the documents provided by the plaintiff may be forged. A signature cannot be authenticated by sight alone. And the recording, if it exists, must have its source verified. Judge Evers nodded. We will hear the recording first. Then a handwriting expert will present the analysis. Robert plugged the USB into the court's audio player. A soft crackle filled the room, then my father's voice came through, clear, slow, and resolute. Blake, I want to leave the company to Cora. She is the only one who understands every brick I've laid, every number I've calculated. I will write a new will by hand. Tomorrow. Next came Blake's voice, reluctant but clear. If you're sure, then fine. But let me hold that document after you finish writing it so I can arrange everything. The courtroom fell into complete silence. I saw Brian lower his head, gripping the armrest tightly. Robert stood and handed the handwritten will to the court's handwriting expert. He was a neutral party, appointed in advance, who had analyzed signature samples on numerous documents of my father's. After comparing 17 signature samples from contracts, personal letters, and bank records, I determine with 99.7% accuracy that the signature on the handwritten will submitted by the plaintiff is that of Mr. Douglas W. Evans. The judge quickly made notes on her document. Proceed. At this point, Emma Sloan was called to testify. She wore a dark blue blouse, her hair tied back, her face serious but showing no fear. Emma, Robert began, have you ever witnessed Mr. Blake Carson destroying any documents related to Mr. Douglas's will? Emma nodded. 3 days after the funeral, I was still at the office handling paperwork for another lawsuit. It was nearly 9 p.m. then. I saw Mr. Blake enter Mr. Douglas's office carrying a thick paper bag. Then there was a strong smell of burning paper. Did you see anything specific? Yes. I opened the door and saw him burning stacks of paper in the office fireplace. On the desk was a handwritten document with the heading, Last Will, Cora Lynn Evans. Blake suddenly stood up. This testimony is not credible. She was fired for violating company policies. The judge banged the gavel. Sit down, Mr. Carson. The testimony is sworn, and the court will evaluate its credibility according to proper procedures. The atmosphere in the room seemed to thicken. I felt a cold sweat on the back of my neck. Robert stepped to the center of the room. Your Honor, this is not merely a probate dispute. This is about restoring the honor of a man who has passed, one who tried his best to leave his legacy to the deserving party. But that will was twisted, hidden, and buried by deceit. Today we demand justice do its part. On the other side, Blake's lawyer was unable to further counter. The evidence was too clear, the witness too convincing, and the truth undeniable. Judge Evers left her seat for 5 minutes before returning with the ruling in hand. She stood straight, her gaze scanning the room before reading. After reviewing all evidence, testimony, signature analysis, and the audio recording, the court declares, the current will submitted by Mr. Blake Carson is invalid due to signs of unauthorized alterations to the deceased's will. The handwritten will with the wet signature of Mr. Douglas Evans is restored as the sole legal will. Cora Evans is the sole heir to the entire estate according to the deceased's wishes. I closed my eyes, tears quietly falling, not because of victory but because finally, my father's voice was heard. Additionally, the judge continued. This case file will be forwarded to the prosecutor to consider charges for evidence destruction and will forgery by Mr. Blake Carson. Simultaneously, the withdrawal of company funds by Mr. Brian Evans during the dispute will be investigated separately for breach of trust. I looked toward Blake. He sat silently, his face pale. Brian stood, pulling out his phone as if to escape reality. No one had any more excuses. Robert turned to me, taking my hand. We did it. I squeezed his hand gently, nodding. Knowing this journey was not over, but today I reclaimed the most precious thing. The truth. And my father, somewhere, was surely smiling. I returned to the Douglas Company office on a March morning, when Seattle's air still carried the lingering chill of winter refusing to retreat. The revolving glass doors at the main lobby reflected my face. Not the daughter standing on the sidelines last year, but the rightful heir responsible for continuing a legacy regained through tears and resolve. Former employees looked at me differently. Not because I was the new boss, but because throughout the lawsuit, they had watched silently, supported quietly, and now, with truth confirmed in court, their trust had returned. Blake was arrested 3 days after the verdict, right at his downtown law office. The press reported he was charged with 3 counts: forgery of legal documents, evidence destruction, and obstruction of justice. Photos of him handcuffed, head bowed, stepping out of the courthouse with a dazed expression flooded morning newspapers. Once a symbol of Seattle's legal elite, now just a shadow of arrogance and greed. Brian was different. He chose the familiar path, escape. The following Monday morning, I received a call from a federal investigator. Brian was caught at Los Angeles International Airport, preparing to board a flight to Thailand. His passport was under a false name, cryptocurrency assets exceeding $1 million, along with evidence he had used company funds to launder money across 3 countries. He's in our custody, the agent said, and will press additional charges for intentional business sabotage. I replied simply with thanks. I felt no satisfaction, no joy, just a sense of closure, as if someone finally shut a door left ajar for too long. The first board meeting since I became CEO was held in the 14th floor glass-paneled wood room where my father once stood before massive drafting tables presenting designs as if telling a story. I entered, carrying the carefully prepared plan, placing it before each member. A new path for the company. No giant shopping centers, no lavish skyscrapers. But homes. Homes for low-income families. Homes for veterans. Homes for single mothers struggling between 2 jobs and still unable to pay rent. We have skilled engineers, competent contractors, dedicated architects, and a legacy from people like my father, who believed building was not just about concrete and columns, but creating places where people can live, breathe, and hope. The room was silent as I presented each step, from local financial partners, city government incentives, to sketches of eco-friendly housing using recycled materials and pre-installed solar power systems. I paused, then looked up. I know this isn't a path to instant profit, but it's a long-term path. And true to why this company was founded, to build community. A minute passed in silence. Then Diana, the woman who had stood with my father for over 40 years, now a strategic advisor for the company, placed her hand on the table. I support this, she said, looking me straight in the eyes. Douglas would be proud. One by one, the other members nodded. A few days later, I organized a company-wide meeting in the large hall. I didn't stand on a podium, just right in the middle of everyone, no microphone, no prepared speech. I'm not here as the one in charge, I began. I'm here as part of this family. And if any of you ever felt lost, ever thought this company belonged only to those sitting upstairs, I want today to be the day we change that. Applause followed each sentence, genuine and heartfelt. I saw familiar faces and new ones, all looking at me not just as the rightful heir, but as the one bringing hope back to a company once fractured by its own blood. The following week, I started working with the design team on the first project, a housing complex in Tacoma, where I once went with my father on a survey trip as a student intern. The land was near a small school surrounded by red maples and a few family-owned shops. My father had said, "If I don't get to build this place, then you must." I held the map in my hands, tracing each contour of the land as if touching an unfinished promise. I invited Natalie to join the team in brainstorming how to incorporate shared community spaces into the project. She stood in the middle of the room, sketching by hand on a whiteboard a model of a small library integrated within the housing complex, her eyes shining like a child painting the city of their dreams. "We can add a community garden on the east corner," she said, "so families can grow vegetables, connect, and kids can learn how to care for something from seed to harvest." I nodded, emotions welling up inside me. My father never spoke loudly about the dream he nurtured. He quietly planted those seeds in people's hearts, and now I am the one who must make them bloom. As I left the design room at the end of the day, I paused in the hallway, looking through the large glass window toward the sun setting in the distance. The brilliant orange light bathed the city, covering the streets, buildings, and the land soon to become home to dozens of families. I closed my eyes, hearing my father's voice carried on the wind. "Build with all your heart, daughter. Never forget that." I won't forget. And I won't stop, not because I bear the Evans name, but because I've come to understand that a true legacy isn't in real estate value, but in the value of people, and how we choose to rebuild everything from the ruins. That morning, the sky was unusually clear. Seattle still held a lingering chill of late winter, but the sky seemed washed clean after last night's rain, blue and wide open, like a deep breath in a life too crowded. I stood on the empty lot, a former abandoned parking lot nestled between two low-rise neighborhoods in the south of the city, now surrounded by fences printed with the company's new logo. Signs were posted along the frontage. Douglas Gardens, an eco-friendly community housing project. Groundbreaking in April. I looked up, took a deep breath. The scent of moist earth mixed with the morning air calmed my heart. This land isn't large, but to me it's a beginning. The first ground I've reclaimed, not from the market but from the shadows of what was once lost. I pulled an old envelope from my coat pocket. Its edges were worn, the blue ink smudged in places from tears. I had read it so many times I knew every word by heart, but this morning I wanted to read it once more. Like a silent ritual, like a thread connecting me to the man I had both loved, forgiven, and learned to move forward without his protection. If you're reading this, then I am at peace. Because only when you overcome the crossroads of hatred and anger, and choose the path of creation, will you truly understand why I trusted you. Not because you are my daughter, but because you are yourself, the one who can stand where others have fallen. The one who can raise her voice when everyone else is silent. I held the letter tightly, then folded it carefully, placing it on a large stone nearby, where the project's first flower bed would one day be. I bowed my head and whispered to the wind. "I did it, Dad." I didn't expect an answer, but the wind brushed through my hair like a gentle touch from another world. Enough for me to know that even though he's no longer here, he's watching every step I take. Behind me I heard footsteps. Soft. Just enough not to break the moment, but clear and steady, like the people arriving. I turned around. Natalie came first, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. Next was Emma, wearing a gray sweater and wrapped in the scarf she once said she kept, to remember the days no one believed in me. And finally Diana, hair tied up, long coat on, holding large format printed blueprints. "We're on time, right?" Natalie smiled, handing me a cup. "Don't tell me you plan to cut the ribbon alone." I accepted the coffee, nodding softly. "No. I'd never do this alone." Emma sat beside the stone, her gaze distant. "I used to think I was just a witness in this story. But then I realized, sometimes witnessing the truth is the bravest thing we can do." Diana spread the blueprint over the makeshift wooden table. The wind lifted a corner of the paper and she used her coffee cup to hold it down. In the morning light, the drawings revealed each small house, the shared garden patches, the stone paths connecting rows of homes, all leading to a central courtyard named the Gathering Grove. "My father used to say," Diana said thoughtfully, "people need a place not just to live but to connect. A garden isn't just for growing vegetables but for planting hope. A place where children can run barefoot without fear. Where the elderly can sit without feeling abandoned." I looked at the drawings, silent. It wasn't just a project. It was a memory, a dream of my father's I'm making real with my own hands, and with the faith of those who didn't abandon me when everything seemed to fall apart. Natalie sipped her coffee, looking at me. "You know, for the article coming out next week, I titled it, 'From the Rubble of a Legacy, This Woman Built a Future.'" I laughed. "Sounds like a soap opera headline." "No," she said seriously. "It's the truth." We sat there for a long while, no one saying more. The wind blew through, cold but not biting. I looked around the lot. Excavators waiting, steel fences up, neat construction signs hanging. This was not an end. This was a beginning. But unlike any before, this time I wasn't walking alone. Emma stood, brushing off her hands. I have to get back to the office. The planning documents still need approval. Diana folded the drawings, looking at me warmly. You know, not everyone has the courage to turn pain into action. You didn't just keep the company, you made it something bigger. I said nothing. I just looked at them, each one. The witnesses, the companions, those who stood for the light while the other side hid behind a curtain of lies. After they left, I lingered alone. I walked slowly around the land, lightly touching each foundation stake. Every step I took was a silent reminder. I didn't choose the easy path. I refused the handshake of one trying to buy my conscience. I stood in court not to gain more, but to restore justice for the father who no longer has a voice. Stopping in the middle of the lot, I looked up at the sky, a vast expanse no longer covered by tall buildings or the noise of struggle. I saw my father in every breeze, in every patch of earth waiting to be raised into a home. And I understood, they may have tried to take the legacy that should have been mine. But they didn't know that very thing gave me something even stronger. A reason to continue. A strength to create. I didn't just reclaim justice. I'm creating a future. What would you do if one day everything you believed in, family, legacy, loyalty, was suddenly put on the line, twisted by greed and betrayal? Would you have the courage to stand up, claim justice, but still choose to walk with love and compassion? I believe each person carries a flame, small but enough to light even the darkest path. And sometimes only after losing everything do we truly find our own way. If my story resonates with you, if you've ever been misunderstood, had to stand alone in the storm but chose not to fall, share your feelings below. I want to hear your story. And if you believe in the power of truth, resilience, and rebirth from ruins, don't forget to follow the channel. Because there are many more stories about family, choices, and the paths each of us walks, waiting to be told.